In this lecture, we're going to look at how you can work with SQLite in your QML applications. SQLite allows you to save your data in a database that is embedded in your system, and you don't need to create a database or do some kind of connection to the database. You use the database that is available to you, and all you have to do is to create databases and tables and do all kinds of crazy things. We're going to go to Qt Creator and play with us in Qt Quick. Okay, so here we are in Qt Creator. We are going to create our project pretty quick. It's a Qt Quick application. We call it SQLite demo. Save it in the usual location. Hit next. Choose our Qt version. Choose your kit and finish. We want to change the text here to say SQLite demo. We want to do our imports here. If you remember, we have to import Qt Quick local storage if we want to work with SQLite databases. So we say import Qt Quick local storage 2.0. We also want to import Qt Quick dialogues because we are going to do a dialogue to choose a color. Let's do 2 here. So what we want to do is pretty much what we did in the settings. We want to save the location of the window and the color of the window, but this time we are going to use an SQLite database. We're going to put in a rectangle component. ID is going to be contained. It is going to fill the parent, and it is going to be red by default. So we say red. Inside, we want to have a mouse area because we want it to be clickable for the user to select the color of the window here using a dialog. The mouse area should fill the parent, and when it is clicked, we do something. In the mouse area, we want to put in our dialog, Control-A, Control-I to align. It is nothing fancy. It's everything we've done before. We have a dialog, it has an ID, and we can accept the value or we can reject it. When we click on the mouse area, we want to open the dialog. We're going to say color. Open like this. And we want to give an ID to this window. So we're going to say ID, root ID. This will do. And I think by now we can run the application and be able to change the color of the rectangle that fills the window here. Let's check our IDs. This is right. Let's run. Okay, here is our application. The rectangle is red by default. If you click inside, you see a dialog like this. It says choose color. We can click inside to choose a color, or we can move this slider here to choose between these colors. Let's choose this greenish color, hit OK. You see that our color is in. If we close and run again, our color and position are lost. We close, we open again, you see that it comes in the middle. It takes default values. We want to change this. We want to save the X and Y location of the window. We also want to save the width and height, and we want to save the color that is inside, all using SQLite. Now, we are going to do quite a lot in JavaScript, so it is a good idea to create an external JavaScript file, do our things in there, and import it, and just call the functions to do our dirty work in here. We want to come to QRC here. We add new Qt.js file, which is really JavaScript file. We choose this. We call it database. And we next and finish, and we check this out. We want to come to main QML first and put in a property for our database. We're going to say property var. It's going to be a var, and it's called db, and it doesn't take any value by default. We are going to come back to JavaScript and create a function. We call it db_init to initialize our database. First, we are going to console log initializing. Next, we want to open our database. I am going to put in the statement. We define db in the main QML file, and we are going to be able to call the JavaScript file here and make it look as if this was defined here. So we are going to be able to access things in here. That's why this DB variable is available to us in this function here. Now we have our database opened. This is the database name. This is the version. This is the description of the database. And this is the estimated size of the database in bytes. We looked at this in the introductory video on the chapter here. After you have your database opened, and by the way, this is going to create the database if it is not available. If it is already available, it is going to open it. After you do this, you want to do a transaction. So the transaction we're going to do is to create a table if it doesn't exist. This is a normal SQL query, nothing special here. We are creating a table called SQLite demo table, and it has two fields, a name field and a value field, and they are a data type of text. By now, we should have a database and a table ready to be consumed by our application. We can save data or read data from it. So what we want to do is to store the X and Y location of this window here. Root ID is the ID that we're going to use. We also want to capture the width and height of the window. We also want to save the color that the user chooses here so that next time the user runs the application, the rectangle here displays the background of it in that color. So we are going to define our function to store data. Function, it's not going to take any parameter because it is going to work on the data that we have in our QML file here. We want to console log that we are storing data. Copy that, put that here and say storing data. And we want to check to see if this DB is available and initialized. The way we do that, we say if not DB, return. Okay, if the database is not available, we get out of this function. We don't do anything because we are just going to get errors if we try to work on a database that is not available, that is not properly initialized. We want to put a semicolon here. Next, we want to do a transaction that is going to store our data in the database. So we're going to say transaction function tx. Inside, we are going to pass in the body of the function, and we should put a semicolon at the end. And we put this on different lines so that we have something good to look at. Inside here, we are going to try and update the data that is in this table here if it is already available, or we are going to insert a new data set if the data is not already available. The first thing we want to do is to check and see if an SQLite demo entry is available in our table. The way we do that, we say var result equals tx, our transaction here, which is the parameter that we had. We say execute SQL. Inside, we pass in our SQL query. We are going to select everything from the table where name equals SQLite demo. So I am going to put in the query because I don't want to type it. It is very long. Select everything from the table here where the name equals SQLite demo. If you look at the table that we are designing for, you see that our data entry, the name for that equals SQLite demo. This is what we are checking. I just want you to have some context on what we are doing. This reminds me that we also have to show you how to look at the location of your database. We're going to do that. But first, let's finish this. Okay, now that we have a result here, we're going to check and see if we actually had anything in this entry here. And if we had the entry, we're going to update that with a new data set. If the entry is not available, we're going to write a completely new data set in this entry here. But before we do that, we want to prepare our JSON data that we're going to write in the database. So let's say that. This is actually very easy. You just capture data from your QML component. The X location, the Y location, the width and height, you captured that. And and you put that in a JSON object that we define here. Okay, you see we have X, it's the X location of the root window. Y is the Y location. We have width and height. We also have the colors that we have in that rectangle of ours. We are capturing the red, green, and blue component, and we are putting this in a JSON object that we call obj. This is what we are going to save in the database. Now we want to see the number of rows that we got from this SQL query here. This is going to return the number of rows that have been affected by this. So we can say if result row length equals 1. If we fall here, we already have the data entry and we just need to update it. So here we are going to do an update. If the length is not 1, it is probably 0. We didn't find anything in the database, and we are going to create a new entry. That's what we're going to do here. So here we should say console log updating database table, and here console log creating new database table entry. And here we are going to do the same thing we did here. So we are going to capture this. Okay, copy this because I don't want to type it. I am lazy at typing. And we are going to put in a query to update the data. Here we are going to do the same thing, and we are going to put in a query to create a new database entry. Our query to update is going to look like this. It's nothing fancy really. If you know some SQL, update the table, set the value. It is one value that we want to set, the SQLite demo value, and we want to set it to the value that we pass in here. And we take this object we have here and turn that into a string so that we can save it in the database. You use JSON stringify. This is a method that comes from JavaScript. You can check it in the documentation and see what it does, but it turns your JSON into a string. Okay, just like this, we have updated our database with new data. We want to create a new data set if it is not available, and we are going to do an insert. And we are going to insert into the table. The values are going to be replaceable in these question marks. And what we are going to replace in is the name of the data entry and the value. And the value is really JSON stringifying the object that we have defined here. And just like this, we are able to store data in our database. Okay, if this is not clear to you, take some time to look at it again. It's really easy to understand. The only point where you might think that this is really hard is if you are rusty on SQLite, and it is not very difficult to search for an SQLite tutorial on the internet to have an idea about what we are doing here. Now we have been able to store data. We want to read data. We are going to define a new method that is called read data function. Read data. It is not going to take any parameter. It is going to work directly on the data that we have in our QML file. The start is really going to be the same. We can copy this and put that in our new function. It's going to save us from typing a few things. We should say reading data, and we are checking to see if the database is available. And if it's not available, we're going to return out of this function immediately. Next, we want to do a DB transaction, and it is going to be the same thing we did here. So we can actually copy this and paste this here and take out everything inside, because we are going to do something completely different. We are going to read data from the database. We should say that here, reading data. We want to select everything in the database table where the name field equals SQLite demo. This is what we are doing here. And we want to know if we actually got something from the database. This is where we know that we have data that we can work with. Now we need a way to take the data that we get from the database and turn that into a JSON object that we can then retrieve data from and use in our QML code. The way you do that, you get the first row from the values that you get from the database, and you call value on it, and you have a value which is a string really. You need to convert that to a JSON object, and you do that by calling JSON parse and passing in your string value. And by now we have a JSON object that we can retrieve data from. Okay, now that we have the JSON object, we can read the data into our QML properties. We say root ID x equals object x. Remember when we stored the data, we put that into a JSON object, and we had these attributes. We have x, y, width, height, color red, color green, color blue. And you see that we are reading everything by using the same attributes we use to store data. This is very important because if you get this wrong, the system is not going to know what you are trying to get from the database. Be careful about this. And by now, when you call the read data method, you are going to read the data from the database and stuff that into your QML components. We are storing location and size information on the window, and we are storing the background color of the rectangle inside. What remains now is coming to the QML file and import our JavaScript file. You already know how to do that. We want to come here and say import database.js, and we import that as something. You specify a namespace here that you want to use to call your functions. Now we want to come to the end of the window here and say component on completed. We want to do something and say component on destruction. We want to do something on completed. This is where this window here is loaded in memory, and we want to do something. We want to read the data and stuff that into our QML properties here. We are going to set location and size information. We also are going to set the color here. Okay, this is how we read the data, and we can say JS read data just like this. But before we read the data, we need to initialize our database. So we should say JS DB init. I just forgot that in a moment. I'm sorry about that. And when our component is about to die, we are going to save the data. So we're going to say JS saves store data. This is what we called it. I clear the space here. Do the same here. And this is neat. And by now we can run the application and see if our thing is working here. Let's run. You see that it reads data, and it is reading the data from one of my previous test applications, but you get the idea. So we're going to bring it back in the middle here, and we're going to try and change the color. Let's change it to blue like this. Blue. Okay, let's change it to pink like this. Move the window to the left here. Close the application, and you see that we get an error here. We didn't call the method right. We called it execute. We did it all over the place. So we should say execute SQL. I'm going to be very careful about this now. Execute SQL, is it right? Where else do we have this? Execute SQL. Execute SQL here. I think we should be okay by now. I'm sorry for this. Let's bring the application somewhere, change the color to yellow this time. We change the size of the window. We close the application. What the heck is wrong with you? Let's save this. Come to QML, change a few things. put in some spaces to have Qt Creator pick our changes. Okay, we changed the location of the window, we changed the size, and we changed the color in the middle to a green. Hit OK. Close the application. Now it is updating data. If we run again, our application should be in a new location and it should have the color that we have specified. This is what I am talking about when I tell you that you can save data. This is really all we had to do in this lecture. And it isn't really rocket science. You have to use the functions as we used here, and you can adapt these examples to save whatever you want in your database. The key here is to know your SQLite and know how to handle these queries: create, read, update, and delete. And if you can do that, you're not going to have any problem storing your data in Qt Quick applications. The last thing I want to show you before we wrap up this lecture is how you can show the location of your database file. And the way you do that, you come here in the main CPP file, import qdebug, include qdebug. It is a class that allows you to do things like console log, showing log messages, and we want to come down here and put our statement to debug output the location of the SQLite database. This is how you put it out. If we run the application now, we are going to see that in the application output, we are going to see a path on our drive, and you see that this is the location where my things are stored. We can go there. I think we are going to need to take out these double backslashes because sometimes they mess things up. I don't think Windows is going to recognize this, but we can take that out manually. Let's take this out, copy this, come to my computer, paste that in here, and you see that we have QML in here, we have offline storage, we have databases, and these are our database files. Okay, you cannot read this because it is binary file, but if you delete this, for example, let's delete that. Okay, we can't delete this because it is being used by some application, but I think we just lost our data. Let's run the application again, and you see that it becomes red. Okay, you get the idea. That's the location of your database. It is trying to open this version, and I think it is not existent. We should delete that file. How do we delete that if it is being used by an external application that we don't know? Now it is gone. Let's come to Qt Creator, clean everything, clean project, build clean all. Let's close this, run the application, and this time we are not having this error. And you can store the data again. Let's make it green, reduce the size, close the application, start it again, and you see that it is working correctly. This is really all I had to say in this lecture. I hope you know how you can use SQLite to save and load your data in your Qt Quick applications. And I hate to say it, but this is the last lecture in the course, and you have learned quite a lot if you have watched all the lectures in the course. In the next lecture, I am going to give you a few tips on how you can improve on the knowledge that you have in this course and move further in your Qt Quick UI development. I'll see you in the next lecture.